Thank you for joining us in today's webinar. Our session today is going to be looking at the two main architectural approaches for privileged access management. And in a time of year when we're expecting new analyst reports, some things to think about before you review the reports and have a think through what might be appropriate to your organization. My name is David Dingwall. I'm a strategist at HelpSystems. What that means is I spend a lot of time talking to customers and prospects, looking at how tools and services are used by organizations of all kinds, especially in the current climate where everybody's looking for better ways to do things faster and better and more efficiently. Automation is a huge part of our conversations. That is, from an operational perspective, a big part of why people look at privileged access management tooling. So today's agenda is going to be very straightforward and simple, I think. Let's talk about the two main types of privileged access management solutions, how they are deployed, and especially over multi-year rollouts, how these solutions need some assistance and support, and some of the ways that you might be able to avoid being tracked and managed. And then lastly, let's wrap the session up looking at how we need to look at the analyst reports that are coming out the second half of this year and reflect them against some of the organizational changes you're having in your companies and where that might lead you about tool selection going forward. So in a single picture, let's look at the two main architectures used in most organizations for privileged access management. The acronyms PASM, Privileged Account and Session Management, and PEDM, Privileged Elevation and Delegation Management. Those acronyms were, I believe, created by Gartner some years ago, but they have been lifted and used by other analysts in all kinds of ways in their reports over the last 5 years or so. So it's sadly, unfortunately, you need to recognize these acronyms because they're used and spread through the analyst reports. So typically, reports are, and the tools that the vendors talk about, we use those acronyms as well. So let's start with the first, the PASM solution. I think it's fair to say that most of these solutions are seen as gateway products. These gateway products interpose themselves between the user, in this case, typically the support team member, and the production infrastructure that's being protected, where security policy and the passwords and credentials used for the session to get access to the system, and if appropriate, keystroke or session logging is applied at the gateway choke point. And the pluses of this solution is it can be implemented rapidly. And for your business, they like this type of solution because there is no software being installed in the production infrastructure, therefore no upfront interruption. What this means is typically many organizations start with a PASM solution and they may migrate to another type of PAM solution over time. The second main type of architecture, PEDM, is slightly different. The session between the user and the endpoints is very much straightforward. People log into systems and network infrastructure straight away, but the software taking control of authentication and authorization on every production system. So a little bit different way to deploy going forward. But it's used in organizations typically with compliance regimes that are in play and where there's typically different risk levels for the endpoints. Some may be low security, some may be very, very high. So let's look at some of the architecture in a little bit more detail. The first type of solution, more commonly known or has been known in the past as a password vault solution. These technologies from very well-known companies is more than 20 years old. And originally, these solutions were designed to provide and store the passwords of users and critical accounts in a secure vault. And then based on a workflow, the support team member could check that out. After a few years, that technology changed slightly. So the secure password was injected into the session, so the support team member never actually knew what the password was. And the session would continue without a credential being used or needed or learned by the support team member. So that was seen as a secure way forward. Typically, these solutions as a gateway product, they only had a small number of devices that may have been delivered as an appliance. More recently, they may be delivered as a virtual machine. In one or two locations, there are not many systems, and they synchronize between the two nodes. So there's a fair amount, that's a certain amount of basic redundancy between them. The constraint of these gateway systems being in very well-known locations means that you need to think about network planning and design and availability to your production infrastructure from these gateway environments. The availability of the gateway systems themselves becomes very important, so high availability and redundancy in these environments becomes critical. Over the last 5 or 6 years, these Vault products have changed quite substantially. Some vendors have added SSH user key support to meet stronger authentication requirements. Some of these solutions have been supporting OTP functions for many, many years, but the changes in government regulation, especially in North America, is gradually delisting OTP as an authentication methodology, and many organizations are switching over to LDAP authentication instead. So Vault solutions were created primarily 20 years ago or so. Most of these solutions are focused on enterprises with very well-known endpoints, with systems and switches and routers that don't change location very often, very well stable and static infrastructures. That is an interesting proposition as we're all moving into the cloud world where things are significantly more dynamic, but I'll talk a lot more about cloud later in the session. The second type of infrastructure, looking at a little bit more detail, your admin and support teams can connect using secure protocols like SSH directly to the production endpoints. So from a user experience perspective, nothing really changes. The response from the system, if you're doing something that is not allowed, you're not allowed to switch account or not allowed a privileged command, you'll get a new kind of message, but it doesn't change the way you actually log into systems and network devices. The agent technology installed in the operating system takes over control of authentication and authorization, and it is actually talking to a local database somewhere on the local network near the server. Let's just call it a policy database for now. And most data centers will have one or two of these devices or virtual machines to be able to respond with very, very low latency. These databases are read-only copies of a master system, which is somewhere else on the network. It's a single point of administration where all the security policy is updated, and that is automatically replicated to the copies that live in your data centers. So architecturally, there are some changes. The infrastructure is significantly more scalable. Most of the larger vendors here, including HelpSystems, can scale to up to 100,000 devices without a lot of problems. Security policy is live and is updated, can be updated in real time without it significantly affecting production endpoints at all. And quite interestingly, part or all of your infrastructure can be secured and people can access the systems without using passwords at all. something that has become more of a pressure as compliance regime requirements and regulations change. One nice side effect of all of this is this type of technology can be used to scale out into either private clouds or public clouds by first taking copies of the policy databases into the cloud zone that you're going to be adding instances to, and then just creating the instances that are going to take the workloads. So from that perspective, it allows securities policy to span zones very, very simply. Of course, when infrastructure crosses over and that starts interacting with real human beings, there's all kinds of interesting policy side effects that we need to take care of with our PAM solutions. The first being namespace consistency. This is not really a security policy question per se. You can be inconsistent and map a user to multiple accounts. But from an audit and logging perspective, with the way that log data is correlated in SIM solutions, being clear about which person is actually accessing a system with their own account or transitioning to a privileged account is something that needs to be very, very clear and consistent. We have to also manage account transitions on Linux and Unix systems, going from a user account to root or user account to Oracle, or a Windows systems going from a user account to the administrator privileged account. So those transitions need to be handled and managed very, very cleanly. Log data needs to be pushed into your company's log vaults. In the past, security systems had their own databases and they looked at their own level of security. Today, that's changed architecturally quite drastically. All security solutions really need to be able to push their log data to an enterprise log vault for correlation analysis. And then lastly, our infrastructures themselves are very dynamic. We have companies that are part of organizations that are taking part in a lot of M&A or a set amount of divestment of divisions over time. So to be able to spin out and clone the security system very simply, or to be able to cut a division out of your infrastructure, or to bring on a competitor that you've just purchased and bring them under your security policy very, very rapidly, is a key feature of the security tools that we're talking about here. Access management as a principle, I think everybody understands the model. However, the rate of change and the granularity of what's been required of us as security professionals has changed significantly over the last few years, and that pressure is only going to grow. They say that most organizations of all sizes are having to comply with at least 3 separate compliance regimes in parallel, and that number is only going to grow depending on how many geographies you are operating in around the world. A good example of that is session recording. In North America, it's quite common to set up either keystroke logging or video recording of sessions, and that's seen as acceptable practice. In Europe and in Asia, that would be seen as an HR violation, violating the privacy of your employee. So you need to set up a different type of session recording in those geographies. So your system needs to be able to handle different types of security policy to different grades and different types of granularity. There is a more general issue with security systems in general all over the world, that password access management is seen as completely out of control and is not secure at all. There's been a lot of pressure and change to use strong authentication. The password hack is just so easy to achieve with a desktop PC these days. So online authentication using different types of tokens, the space that OTP lived in very, very nicely over the years, but is now gradually fading away. Or the use of multi-factor authentication tokens. For example, if you have a part of your infrastructure that, say you're in government, that you're processing the payments, the tax payments for your region that you need to process, and some of that's coming in with cards that people are either phoning in or using your website, the infrastructure that's processing that data needs to be significantly more secure than your main systems. A whole different set of access control and access control regulations need to be applied to that small subset. So that does affect which kind of PAM tool you might be using. There's an ongoing role of ways of accessing systems that are seen as insecure. Obviously, in the past, Telnet and FTP on Linux or Unix systems, the Berkeley R commands have been banned years and years ago. More recently, OTP is gradually being wound out of organizations, and there will come a point where you need to have control to say, do no more OTP in any part of my infrastructure, and to guarantee that to your auditors. And then, of course, coming back to people again, individuals and human beings change jobs and they change roles both inside your organization and they leave your company. These types of solutions need to be able to handle the account transitions, changing roles and systems they can get to, or closing out their accounts and removing the accounts from the production endpoints in a completely automated fashion. The concept of doing a production system review and trying to find any accounts that are stale and no longer used, the current compliance regulations are pretty strong about making sure that unused endpoints need to go. Unused accounts need to not be there for you to pass your audit. That's something that the tools that you're depending on in this space need to be able to handle for you, and for it to provide a guarantee it can be done in a very short period of time. We've talked about multi-factor authentication in multiple webinars over the last few months. Just to underline from a PAM perspective, it's not just operating system access. The accounts that are managing and changing the very dynamic infrastructures for our private clouds, things like KVM or VMware, the management tools themselves give you a massive control over how this infrastructure is built and managed above the operating system level. These tools need themselves to be protected with MFA. In the cloud space, Amazon tools now no longer support OTP authentication at all if you create a new account in Amazon to satisfy US government requirements. And OpenStack, technology that's used for new private clouds, its director tool is also it's possible to be able to protect with MFA. And then from a role and management perspective, there is a much more clearer separation. As I mentioned, tools in the past tended to collect their own logs and report on them themselves. There's been a massive policy change in principle that all security tools can go ahead and carry out security management and enforcement, but all the logs need to go to a centralized resource, a centralized database. Typically these days, that's an event manager or a SIM solution, where an auditor, either internally or externally, can use their own tools and look at the data in much more creative ways, looking for patterns, correlation management, user behavior analytics. That can be done at multiple levels, and that really requires the data from all your security solutions to go there. So the days of a PAM solution being the single source of reporting on the data and the way that your users are accessing your system, now that's pretty much gone as a concept. And we are focusing our efforts on partnering with SIM vendors to make sure our data is available and can be tagged and classified as appropriate. So let's talk about what happens to both of these solutions, especially when they're implemented in organizations over multiple years. We see various problems and weaknesses that need to be managed operationally by your management and by policy itself. So let's start with the vault-based solutions. So accessing production systems through a gateway product from a session perspective is reasonably straightforward. However, there is a physical system access problem almost straight away that you need to take control of. If you can get access to a credential that's valid for a session, say from the Vault product, if a person picks up their laptop, gets access to the computer room and plugs in to a network point or to a serial connection, and can actually get direct access to the operating system without using the gateway solution, then you have an audit problem. Someone's accessing the system with a valid credential, but there's no log history of what they're doing or why they're getting access. The same thing is true for production support. People need to be able to update and patch systems. Typically, a lot of that work often is using automation tools, but sometimes you do actually have to log onto the console and do things with a privileged account. So that access itself is not being tracked by your gateway product. You need some other way to log the operating system upgrade or patching through some other mechanism. The gateway product doesn't help you at all. What we also see over time is these Vault products tend to get a bit stale from a version perspective. People are not willing to shut them down or to update the software. People regard them as appliances, and those appliances just sit in a rack and work for a number of years. That pressure to keep it up to date, both from a software versioning perspective, but also updating the policy, is being charged and pushed by supporting multiple compliance regimes, and the activity to get changes in place needs to happen very, very quickly. So typically in the past, a Vault appliance may have only been touched for a system update or patched once or twice a year. These days, changes need to be hitting those devices and updating the security of the product itself and the central security policy at least once or twice a month. And some organizations are just not ready to handle that. For the agent-based solutions, things are a little bit different. The user access is unchanged, obviously, but the way staff are allocated access to systems is a little different. It's focused on their business groups and their technical teams that they're associated with. So if someone is a member of the Oracle support team, they would be granted automatic access to any system running an Oracle database, and then their activity on that system would be tracked, logged, and reported. So that makes things a little bit easier as people move between jobs, and someone, let's say, leaves the Oracle team, their access to the Oracle systems would be removed instantly. So there's a fair amount of automatic management and control that just happens. What's more interesting is some global policy changes that we see people not taking a lot of attention to. Things like banned passwords. You may have seen articles in the press in the last couple of weeks about California setting up regulations about no default passwords or banned passwords for organizations should be tracked and managed and controlled. So an example, if you're in a organization that's buying other companies, the banned password list in the company that you have bought may include the company name of company B, but may not include your company. So just simple things on global security policy management and keeping that up to date is very important. Regulations are pushing the use of passwords to become much more irrelevant, but they still have rules and regulations around password complexity, and they get more complex over time. So keeping that password complexity current is something that needs to be tagged and managed as someone's job periodically. And then lastly, especially as organizations change the way they operate, naming conventions for groups, naming conventions for systems and business units change over time. That needs to be kept up to date inside your policy database. Not so much for the access management piece, but more for the audit and reporting. So the reporting reflects the way you're actually using your infrastructure in real time, not the way it was defined 2 or 3 years ago. And then lastly, again, around centralized policy management, making sure that insecure protocols are defined to be closed out automatically, even as software is installed on individual endpoints, to be able to guarantee to the auditors that it's just impossible to happen in your infrastructure is something that just needs to be easily available. So you can flick that switch as soon as you need to. So 3 things to think about when you're looking at your current PAM solution and changes that are coming and hitting us all right now, and thinking forward to where you might need to be in 2 or 3 years' time. The first one is a scale question. Vault solutions are very easy to implement initially in organizations that have no PAM solution. But if your company and organization is growing either organically, and they're saying 50% a year compound growth in endpoints for most organizations, or if you are growing by acquisition and you're acquiring infrastructure from your nearest competitor and you need to get that secure pretty quickly. Vault solutions historically have had reports of knee bends in performance at around the 10,000 node scale. Managing the systems based on individual machine name becomes very difficult to handle at that point. So it's something you need to think about if you're moving from a Vault solution and thinking about the other type of architecture instead. We are all working in a world where cloud is significantly more important from a cost reason, if for nothing else. Putting some of our workloads in the cloud is something that organizations have been doing now for almost 14 years. But now the push to move huge chunks of your business, whole business units, into public cloud zones across multiple geographies is something that also needs to be protected with a PAM solution. And as I mentioned, the Vault solutions are great inside enterprises, but don't really handle the transition into public cloud. Public cloud infrastructures are very dynamic. The systems come and go on a very frequent basis. It's not very static infrastructure and doesn't map well to its data model. Also, the connection between a system in the public cloud and the enterprise vault sitting inside your own data center is something that is not really supported by most vault vendors. And then lastly, we're in a world now where multi-factor authentication has either hit us or is going to hit us all very, very soon. These devices and technologies themselves have life cycles, some with no more than 3 years before they get updated. Some other vendors maybe up to 7 years. Again, in a very dynamic world where mergers and acquisitions happen, if your acquired company has made a different choice for an MFA tool, to be able to assimilate that into your infrastructure without taking on significant costs, it would be nice if your PAM solution can handle multiple MFA devices at the same time. So I wanted to wrap today's session up there. There are architectural differences and operational differences between the different types of tools in the PAM space. They both have pluses and minuses from a setup perspective and an operational perspective. However, there's all kinds of pressures coming from compliance requirements, not just in your country, but around the world. And the analysts are reporting on PAM tools and technologies. Gartner's due to do a Magic Quadrant report later on this year. EMA has just finished a PAM report that's looking at the impact of how people set and manage passwords on PAM solutions and some of the drivers that might make you think about which of these two architectures you might want to look at. Coincidentally, we'll be having a separate webinar with EMA in, I believe, the beginning of November. So if you're free and available, please come and join us on that session. And then when Gartner publishes its report, I'm sure HelpSystems will also be running a webinar reflecting on the results of that report when it comes out. So thank you very much for your time today. I hope you've enjoyed the session. If you have any questions, by all means, please contact us. We can take any questions on the session today. If they're more complex, we can take them offline via email or via telephone or via Skype. It's very easy for us to do. Well, I'm not seeing any questions on today's session, so we'll wrap it up there. Thank you very much for your time. We will look at any emails that are coming from today's attendees and follow up with you on an individual basis. Thank you very much. Goodbye.